Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Smooth Move webinar, How to Navigate the Process of Finding Off-Campus Housing. We are excited to see so many friends, families, and parents in attendance for today's session. We will be discussing how to help your student navigate the process of finding off-campus housing. So first, let's do some quick introductions. I'll start. My name is Dilna Kama, and I'm part of Student Life at The Ohio State University, and I work with our Willie J. Young Senior Off-Campus and Commuter Student Engagement Team. And now,
Hi, everybody. My name is Molly Hagerty. I'm the Managing Director of Student Legal Services. If you're not familiar with our office, we are a nonprofit law office that contracts with Ohio State to provide legal services to students regarding the issues they may face while they are in school.
And we also have a few special guests that have joined us today. So Terry and Ryan, if you would introduce yourselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Terry Cugliari, Associate Director for Sorority Fraternity Life at Ohio State. I oversee the second year approval process for our sophomores that choose to live in sorority fraternity housing.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Lovell. I serve Ohio State in our Dean of Students office as one of our Associate Deans of Students and work with a couple of different areas within student life. Our Student Advocacy Office, Student Conduct, our fantastic sorority and fraternity life team, of which Terry is a member. But then I also work with our Parent and Family Relations Office.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so again, we're really excited to have you here tonight. Today's webinar is really an opportunity for Student Life and Student Legal Services to provide an avenue for you to gain tips and tools to support your student during their off-campus housing search. We also wanted to share with you how we're communicating this information directly to your students. We provide a variety of Smooth Move sessions throughout the year. In the autumn, we're going to focus on the housing search. And in the spring, after most of the students have signed their leases, we'll focus on how they will live off campus successfully. All the resources and websites we talk about tonight will be provided in the important links section of your digital resource package, which we will be sending out to you after this webinar. And finally, we ask that you utilize the Q&A feature during today's webinar. Keep in mind that we have a lot of information to cover tonight, so we're going to respond to each question after the webinar. Please, when you submit your question, also include your email address. So we do have a few learning objectives for the evening that you could read through here. These are the same learning objectives that we are giving to your students when we present to them. Again, the goal of this webinar is to provide you with tips and tools to support your student as they secure housing and sign a lease. So we want you to help understand common leasing terms. We want to give you a guide to walk your student through a prospective home and adequately assess the safety considerations. Also a guide to walk through and identify and document the condition of the property. And finally, we want to help you identify future expenses and consider how they might fit into your student's future budget.
So next, we're going to talk about how we're going to kind of walk through this process today, right? So we're going to look at the who to consider, the what you need to know, when to do this process, where your student may consider living, and then finally, how your student's going to assess potential future properties.
Great, so the who. Probably just as important as the place they're going to be renting is who are they going to be living with? Signing a lease with another person is a legal relationship. In the residence halls, we tell the students, you have a social relationship, certainly. But when you're moving off campus, you add kind of that business legal relationship because there's money involved. So it's incredibly important for your student to take their time to pick who their roommate might be. Some of the questions you might help or ask to help your student in making these choices are you confident that they're going to be able to pay their share of the rent on time each month? Is this somebody you're going to be able to get along with for 12 months, living in close quarters with, quirks and all? Is this somebody that you trust not to destroy the property or to allow others into the property, guests and things like that, who might cause damage to the property? These are all really important questions that your students should be asking themselves before they're moving in with someone. When your student does decide on who their roommate is, make certain that your student is talking about and considering certain things. We really highly encourage you to sign or to have your student sign a roommate agreement. We have that on our website, and you can also find it at the go link go.osu.edu/roommates. We encourage the students to go through this roommate agreement before they're living together, because it goes over quite a few things that might potentially cause conflict. So we tell them communication is key. If you're talking about, what is your housing budget? What are the expectations for cleanliness? Who's bringing which furnishings? How about guests and parties? We want to be on the same page about that. Noise preferences. Do we want to have a time of day where we limit the noise so students can study, or, there's the bedtime hours where we're not going to be quite as loud? Are we going to allow overnight guests? Dylan and I have been doing this for a really long time. And a lot of what we see that cause problems for students are these kind of like social norms and social issues that come up once people are living together off campus. Remember, your student and the roommate might have very different budgets. So we really want to be on the same page with that. And finally, they can go through so many different details in that roommate agreement. But at the end of the day, what is really, really important is when there is a conflict, everything can't be covered in that roommate agreement. So what are they going to do to resolve conflict? Especially if we've got these houses with, 5, 6 people living in them. Are we going to have a house meeting? Is there a majority rules? It doesn't really matter really at the end of the day what it is, but just that they have a mechanism for resolving conflict. So, why is this really important? More so than just we want them to enjoy their off-campus living experience. Like I said, it can create a legal relationship between the roommates. Your students are or could be signing a lease that has a joint and several liability clause in it. And that's legal terms, legal speak for everybody on the lease is going to be liable for the monthly rent and any damages that are caused to the property if they're signing a lease with that joint and several liability clause in there. Dylan, thanks. So the what? Again, going through that joint and several liability clause, the lease itself may not actually have that term, but it's going to have the language in it. And like I said, many, if not the majority of leases off campus here in Columbus are going to have this provision in there. And you, as parents and family, really want to pay attention to this because you're probably going to be co-signing or guaranteeing that lease. So you're going to be signing on the dotted line as well, and taking on some liability for not only your student, but you potentially can be taking on liability for their roommates as well. So I give an example to our students when we're presenting to them. Let's say there's 4 of them who are renting. And this is a low average, but they're paying $500 a month per person. So $2,000 for the month total. Leases in general in the university district are going to run for an 11.5-month period. There's a little bit of time there for turnover, but they're going to pay in 12 installments. And so that means that's quite a bit of money on the line, $24,000 for that year to be renting. If one of those roommates decides to transfer and then doesn't pay the rent, well, the rest of the roommates are going to be on the hook if they have that joint and several liability clause in there. And not only the roommates, but likely the co-signers and guarantors could have some liability as well. That also includes liability for damages caused to the property. So again, why we want you to be considering, who your student is living with. Are these big partiers? They're going to cause damage to the property, and then your student is going to be liable for those damages at the end of the lease term. Things we really want to think about. We've also got some other terms on here. And again, you're going to have these common terms sheet when we give you your electronic materials, when we send you the link to this webinar as well. Some other key terms, again, we have the security deposit. That's I tell your students, that's the promise you're making to the landlord, that if there is any unpaid rent or damages at the end of the lease term, the landlord can make up for those losses. Usually the security deposit you're going to put down when you sign the lease, and it's generally equal to 1 month's rent. So in our example, each roommate would put down $500 for a total of $2,000. Holding deposits is a separate fee. It's a separate expense. We don't love holding deposits, I'll tell you, as your lawyers. There's something that we try to discourage students from paying, but the landlords use these holding deposits for those properties that have, they're the bigger properties where there's maybe, 6+ people. And those are the ones that are in more demand because there are less of them. And the landlord will say, please put down this holding deposit. I'll hold the property for you while you decide whether or not you're going to lease the property. And usually that's, it can be even above 1 month's rent, but usually it's about 1 month's rent. The reason we don't love these is usually your student is not putting in writing what happens to them if they decide they're not going to rent, or what happens to them if they decide they are going to rent. So what happens to that money? So we do recommend, if they're going to pay a holding deposit, we want to put in writing what happens to the money either way. Egress, this is another thing that we want our students to be familiar with, that they need to find ways to be safely get out of the property, particularly their bedrooms. If they're sleeping at night and there is a fire or some other safety issue, we want them to be able to leave. So pay careful attention to those basement bedrooms and whether or not they have some recourse for getting out of the property. We also have on here renter's insurance. I'll tell you what, most students do not understand insurance, and I did not either. And I'm very frank with them when we present to our students that I didn't get it either. And so I walk them through exactly what insurance means. What is a premium? What is the policy limits? What is a deductible? But I want you to know as well that your students should have renter's insurance. We even recommend you have renter's insurance when you're living on campus. You've got all kinds of electronic equipment, not to mention books, clothing that might be expensive. All that stuff starts to add up. Furniture when you live off campus. Some of you may own a home and you're thinking to yourselves, well, they're probably covered under my homeowner's policy. And you might be right. You can look at your homeowner's policy. The reason why we still suggest that your students get a separate policy is because your homeowner's insurance likely has a really high deductible. And so it may not be worth it for you to make a claim on your students' losses under your homeowners. Renter's insurance policies are generally have a pretty low monthly premium between $15 to $20. And then finally, we're telling your students about subleasing. So in the event that someone leaves midway through the year, and maybe that's your student because they're going to be studying abroad or they're going to be doing a co-op in a different city, that sublease is an agreement between the person who's renting and then someone who's going to come in and take over that portion of the rent. The issue is there that the contractual obligation is not between the person coming in and the landlord. It's actually between your student and the person coming in. And so that is something we advise students about, and we want them to have that agreement in writing.
Thanks, Molly. All
Yeah.
super helpful information. I just want to remind everyone, utilize that Q&A feature, and don't forget, when you put your question in there, make sure to also put your email address so we can make sure we are sending it to the right person.
Absolutely. So the age-old when question that we get asked by your students year over year. I'll tell you, this question is difficult to answer because the students themselves and some of the area landlords start talking pretty early. As you know, it's only September 22nd, and we're already talking about finding housing for next year. But unfortunately, that is the way that the cycle works. And so what we say on our end from Student Legal Services and Student Life is it's less important when and more important that your students are doing the work of finding the places that they feel comfortable with and that they've researched the property, the area, and the landlord. Okay. That being said, Typically, students are beginning their searches now, between the October-December timeline, and many of the students will have signed a lease by spring semester. That being said, again, this rush to find housing is not necessary. If it were us, we would tell everybody, and we would make it a requirement that you don't sign until spring semester. And part of the reason is there's actually a lot more housing stock available than there ever has been before. Due to the second year live on requirement for students. And because if you take a look around, if you've been near campus lately, you will see all of the new builds. That's just adding beds to the off-campus area that are available for supply. Okay. The desired unit does and may dictate the urgency of the search. So what that means for us is if you're looking for somewhere that's a 6+ bedroom, of course, the supply for those is going to be smaller. You're going to have less supply for that type of property. If you're looking for the 2, the 3, even the 4-bedroom places, you're going to find much more supply. And we, want you, again, no matter what, to be taking the time to do your research.
Great. Now the where. So what you guys are going to see here is a map. We will send this out electronically. It's actually interactive, pretty cool. One of our staff members created this recently, and what you can see is the campus area here. All of these are the different colleges, and then we have the off-campus university district area. So this area is about a 2.8 square mile radius, and this is where you'll see a number of our students living. But certainly more than just our students. This neighborhood has a lot of long-term residents, families, kids, lots of different people living in this community. And so your students can utilize this interactive map. They can go and pick what college and then decide how far they might want to walk and kind of determine from there what areas of the university district they want to live if they so choose to live walking distance to campus. So just wanted to show this to you guys really quickly so you have a little bit of frame of reference, and this will be sent out to you as well. Okay, so the how. So we do have an off-campus living guide. This is available on the website, offcampus.osu.edu. And this off-campus living guide, it's a resource for you, for your student, really walk you guys through the process of searching and finding off-campus housing, and ultimately resources available to your student when they are living off campus. So it's going to walk you through considerations before your student chooses roommates. Friends, as Molly said, friends don't always make the best roommates, but sometimes they do. So they have to make that decision and choose wisely. The guide also outlines resources available to you and your student when seeking information about peer ratings of property owners, how to evaluate a property, and a lot more. So definitely a great way to start that knowledge base, and as you're doing that search with your student. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the additional resources that we have available. So coming up actually during our wonderful parent and family weekend, we will have the Off-Campus Living Expo. So this will be on Friday, October 22nd in the Ohio Union from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And this is kind of that one-stop shop for your students. So not only will they get the opportunity to talk with some of the local area property owners, but you get to see Molly and her team, Student Legal Services. We'll also have a lot of different university offices that can support students during that off-campus living experience. We'll have one of our colleagues that will have a fire extinguisher simulator so students can learn how to utilize a fire extinguisher, for instance. We'll also have our community ambassadors. So these are students that live in the university district, and their role is really to keep students connected both to the university and to the community and support them during their college career. So just to point out a couple people that will be there, but a great opportunity to really have that one-stop shop for the start of off-campus living and an off-campus housing search. Also keep in mind, in addition to this, we have a number of other resources, one of those being our online housing search. So on this housing search, students and yourselves can be as general or as specific as you'd like to be. So if a student knows they want to live in a 3-bedroom apartment with a maximum rent of $3,000 a month and they have to have air conditioning and everything else is negotiable, great. They can plug all of that in, and then the search will narrow based off of the criteria that they utilized. And then they can get a full description of the property as well as location and contact the property owner directly to get further information. A couple things to point out. These property owners or the properties are not university endorsed or approved. They are individuals that work in our community that have available properties. Our role is really to provide you and your student with the resources that are out there to make the best decision for you and your circumstance. In addition to this online housing search, we also have an online roommate search. So for those students that might be seeking roommates either now or perhaps something happens in the future and they're trying to find a replacement roommate, they can log in with their Ohio State username and password, post an ad if they would like to, or simply look at the roommate ads that exist. In addition to that online resource, we also host roommate fairs each semester. We'll probably do a hybrid, do some virtually as well as some in person, so students have the opportunity to meet potential roommates face to face.
All right. So now we're looking at the how. What we want the students and yourselves to do is to really take the time to assess the properties and figure out if it's a right fit for the student. And so what we're providing to them, both online, which they can find available online, but also during our sessions with students, is a checklist. What to go through. It's a guide of how to look at the different properties and to evaluate them. I'm going to go through just a few of these. We're not going to go through these point by point. We go through them in detail with your students during these sessions. Again, these will be available to you as well. We encourage them to do this for each and every property that they will be assessing. Really, really important. If they are considering renting a property, please have your student take a tour of the property itself. We do not want them to look at just the model apartment because, of course, the model apartment means it's pretty and new and nice. So it might look very different than the unit that they may be renting, either in style or size or any other number of criteria. So again, encourage them. And if you can, obviously, take that tour with them, whether that's in person or via video. That probably would be helpful as well, because you might be able to point out some things that they're not thinking about. Definitely encourage them to have this guide with them when they're walking through. Just some of the things we do ask them to assess when they are walking through is we do want them to be looking out for the exterior and the interior safety, things like lighting to the property. Where is the entrance to the property? Is it directly off the street or do they have to go in from a side entrance? Are those well lit? Interior safety, really, really important that the windows open and also lock. That is something that's required by city code, but it is something that you should check before you're signing on the dotted line. Some of these old places, if you will go in them and tour them, the windows have been painted shut. We do not want that to happen. If there is if God forbid there is a fire, trying to get our students out of that kind of property would be difficult. So those are all really, really important things for them to be assessing. Other things, we want them to be looking at, how well kept is the property at that point. If they're going through and touring, we would hope that the properties are in good order at that point, because the landlord is supposed to be showing them what they're going to be renting. So if it doesn't look good upon that initial tour, I would say that's a red flag and you might consider not renting from that property. Again, other factors to consider, and we do have some questions I've seen in the question and answer that we may have a chance to get to, but are the leases individual or are they joint and several? Do they allow you to sublease? What are some of the features? We also want them to consider the neighborhood. Some of your students, especially if they're in their second year, may not have had the opportunity last year to really check out the off-campus neighborhood, especially if they were studying from home. So we're asking them to go and take a look at what's off campus. We want them to take a buddy, but we do want them to see, what does the walk look like? Also, what are the neighbors like? There are some streets in the off campus where there's more social, and then there's ones that are quieter. There's some that are close to permanent residents on the street. And some of that may be important to them depending on what they're looking to get out of their off-campus experience. And then finally, we do ask them to do some research on the landlords themselves. And we do provide a way for them to do that. We do give them different criteria to look at. As Donna said, the university does not endorse landlords or properties themselves, but I will say they do have the undergraduate student government renter's guide on their website. And so USG, the undergraduate student government, has surveyed students over the last 20 plus years about area landlords on a number of different criteria. And that's a good place to look to help you to assess local landlords. What we tell your students is take a look at the past 5 years. Look at the landlord you might be renting from. Check out how they've rated on the different criteria. If they're consistently rating high or consistently rating low, that might be an idea for you, particularly if you're trying to decide between two properties from different property managers or landlords. We also want your students to be thinking about utility costs and what is going to come in over and above the monthly rental amount. So all of these things are ways that we want your student to be assessing the places that they might consider renting. Again, we're going to ask that you take a look through this guide as well, so that you can help prepare your student when it's time for them to be doing the touring of the properties. The how. So we get to this is where I stop the presentation for your students and I tell them, if you remember nothing else except for that I'm funny, just kidding, I don't say that. Well, I do say that, and I am funny. But if you remember nothing else from our presentation today, I want you to remember that before you sign on the dotted line, we want you to have your lease reviewed by our office. Really, really important step in the process. So leases in Ohio are not standard, meaning that the landlord just doesn't go online and find, a standard lease that's given under the law. They craft their own leases for their own properties. And sometimes landlords have different leases for different properties. For a single family home, they're renting out to 10 people versus their multi-unit properties. So what we really want you to know and your students to know is what are their legal rights and responsibilities under that lease and Ohio landlord tenant law, because not only is your student have rights and responsibilities under the lease, there is law that governs the relationship between landlords and tenants here in Ohio. So students are automatically charged the student legal services fee in the beginning of the school year. And as long as they did not waive that service, they're eligible for that lease review. And it costs nothing more than what they've already paid, that $40 fee, annual fee. And what they do is they go online and they schedule an appointment, studentlegal.osu.edu. And that gets them an appointment with one of our attorneys who will go through that lease with them line by line again and talk to them about what their specific rights and responsibilities are under the lease and Ohio law. Certain things we're pointing out to them as we do the lease review. Is there anything that's unenforceable in that lease? There are times when maybe the landlord doesn't know the law well, or maybe they're going around the law a little bit and they're including something in the lease that in fact they're not allowed to do under Ohio law. We aren't necessarily telling the students to go back and have the landlord take it out, because that might not happen. In all honesty, what we want is for them to be aware of it, so that if the landlord does try to enforce a provision such as that they know that they don't have to do that, and they can come to student legal services and get help if they need it. We're also talking to them about how do you get repairs made? Sometimes things break and the condition of the property is not what you would want it to be. What are their rights and responsibilities under Ohio law in order to get those repairs made. We're also talking to them about getting their security deposit back. What steps do they need to take at move-in while they're living off campus and when they move out in order to get that security deposit back? And then finally, we do point out things about their roommates. Again, is this a joint and several lease or is this an individual lease? Does the landlord allow for subleasing under the contract? Some landlords do not allow you to sublease. And so you could get into trouble and in fact be evicted if you're allowing someone else to sublease. So all of those things we're going to go through with your student in detail. Other provisions, things like, are they allowed to have pets? Really important things to know. How do they contact the landlord? Very, very educational process. And again, very easy to schedule. They can go online to our website to do that.
Thank you, Molly. Okay, so before we continue, we're going to pause here and check in with Terry and Ryan and see if there are any questions we can try to answer really quickly, and then we'll continue on.
Sure, Dylan and Molly, got a couple questions in here that I think that you all can provide some insights on. Got a couple questions about the 2-year on-campus living requirement and then the process for juniors and seniors to potentially live on campus.
Great. So we do have a 2-year live-on requirement. So our first and second year students will be living in the residence halls. After that, they are living off campus or commuting, whatever their choice may be. They do have the opportunity to apply for housing on campus post their second year, but keep in mind that there would be a limited amount of rooms available for those that were not first and second year students. Ultimately, that will be out of our university housing office. I believe it is housing.osu.edu for their website, where you can reach out to them directly to ask some of those more specific questions as well.
There are some nuances I know too for some students who may be non-traditional coming in with graduation years that are different than perhaps the typical first and second year students. So if you do have questions specifically about your student who may be a different graduation year, definitely reach out to housing. They respond really quickly to you.
And I'll also make sure that I drop in the chat the 2-year on the housing regulation for the Columbus campus that has some of the nuances that Molly talked about. So I can make sure that I drop that into the chat to supplement the information that you all just talked about. Molly, probably a question here for you. Do you recommend that leases indicate the ability to sublease? Just questions about subleasing in a lease.
Sure, absolutely. Yes. We would really like it if they include that provision to sublease. And that's whether or not you think your student is going to have to sublease or not. Things come up. So students may decide to transfer. At the last minute, they might get a out of town internship. Things definitely come up, and it might not be your student, it might be their roommate who needs to leave. So if there is an ability to sublease, we definitely want to have that ability. If they don't allow for it, you can try to negotiate, and we certainly can talk to your student about doing that. That is one of those lease terms that landlords are less likely to negotiate on. They have their reasons for not wanting to allow subleasing. But yes, the answer to the question in short is we do want that to have the ability to sublease.
And I would also add, you want to have your student talk through with their roommates. If one of them does want to sublease, do the remaining roommates have a say in who is replacing them? Or do they just bring anyone in and they all have to live with that person? So that's another thing that could be really helpful to include in the conversation when they're going through that roommate agreement.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we are going to continue on now. Thank you guys so much. So next we are going to talk and summarize the how and the who. So again, first, we really recommend that you guys are checking out a lot of the online resources we talked about, including that off-campus living guide to get those tips and tools to really having a successful search for off-campus housing. Next, utilize that online online housing search, but also any online roommate search if your student is looking for other roommates. And then seek out the the property owner specific information, whether that be talking with peers that are already living off campus, or as Molly stated, utilizing the undergraduate student government's renter's guide to get peer ratings of property owners in the area. Next, taking a tour, and again, key, touring the actual unit. Looking at a model apartment is fine initially, but you've got to make sure your student looks at the actual unit that they would be renting. And then finally, as Molly stated, if they get anything out of this, it's making sure they get that lease review before they sign or put down any sort of money. Okay, so we're going to talk really quickly about just a couple of the safety resources available through off-campus and commuter student engagement. So you'll see a screenshot here of some information that we do have on our website. We would encourage you and your student to check that information out. In addition, our office does provide some personal safety alarms as well as a few home safety devices. So the window and door alarms, for example, are something that students can go online, reserve a time to pick up, and then have as many as they would like. They can put those on their windows and doors, and when on and triggered, it will put out a very loud, obnoxious noise, very similar to the personal safety alarms. You can see a picture here. Usually students will put that on a keychain or on their backpack, and if they pull that pin, the alarm will go off very quickly. Also, most importantly, we have the Department of Public Safety's website listed. They have a plethora of really, really helpful information. So dps.osu.edu, definitely encourage you to check that out as well. Okay, so a note on budgeting. I know we touched on this earlier, but want to really talk about the things that we will cover with your student and what we encourage them to really think about as they're planning for life off campus. So rent obviously is a big part of that, but on top of rent, your students are going to be paying utility costs, right? Gas, electric, oftentimes water, making sure that they have budgeted in for this. And utility costs can really vary, right? It could be dependent on the size of the home, the age of the home, and the usage, right? How long are those showers taken each morning, those types of things. And so there's many ways that they can budget that in. They can talk with current tenants if they know who those current tenants are and see what kind of usage they're seeing. Overall, I recommend that they budget in, over budget each month, maybe $150, $200 a month per person for those utilities, and hopefully they'll have a little extra to stash away in savings at the end of each month, but definitely making sure that they have budgeted that in. Molly talked earlier about the importance of renters insurance, very, very important, and comparably quite affordable. We're talking probably $10 to $20 a month per person for a renter's insurance policy. For those of your students who may be bringing their vehicle, presumably they're going to have auto insurance. So sometimes companies will provide a discount if they bundle their policies. Also, we would recommend when you talk to those insurance companies, do they offer a discount? This is a college student. This is Ohio State. What is it that they might offer in terms of those additional discounts for you? Next, thinking about that car, if the student is going to be parking or driving to campus, then Campus Park manages all of the parking on campus at Ohio State University. And then we also see some more, Molly mentioned earlier, we're seeing some new builds around campus, and many of them will have garages attached to those buildings or under those buildings. And so they might be charging a monthly fee to park in those garages. And then finally, food. I'm not even going to try to guesstimate what that is, because I think that food budget each month looks very different depending on the person, but making sure they're allocating funds for that. Also keep in mind, just because students are living off campus does not mean they can't take advantage of the on-campus dining plan. So definitely encourage you and your student to look at the options. There are ones that are conducive for those that aren't living on campus, but still want to be able to enjoy some meals on campus throughout the week. Next, things to consider in terms of one-time or unexpected costs. So many times students will park on the street, and a lot of the city streets will require a city parking permit. That can be purchased online, and that is a one-time fee. They can also purchase a visitor pass as well if they would like to do that. There are also those property owners that offer off-street parking, perhaps in a parking lot, driveway, things of that nature. Really getting details on that, though, to make sure that more times than not, it's not going to be an assigned spot to them. It's just a right to try to fight for parking in that lot, for instance. So sometimes you'll see your student will want to do both just to be on the safe side. And then Molly talked about, when students are starting to really consider a place, they may have to pay an application fee initially when they're interested, ultimately security deposits. So really thinking about those costs, because that does add up pretty quickly. And then certainly those initial home setup costs that come along with, building that new home and in that their new apartment or house off campus.
So in summary, the considerations we really want your student to be thinking about is, who are they going to live with and how many people are they going to live with? I will say from our experience, the more people you live with, the more personalities. So it can be a little bit more difficult. That doesn't mean that those people who live with, 6, 7, 8 plus, are guaranteed to have more issues, but it's just, that's kind of our experience. Location, really important. We want them to not only what's close as far as commuting, but what they feel comfortable with coming to and from. Budget and price. I'm not sure whether we did make a plug for this yet, Dilna, but the Scarlet and Gray financial coaching, it is really, really important for them to consider doing that. That's a free service through the Student Wellness Center. And Ryan, if you don't mind putting that up in the chat as well, the students can meet with peer coaches and go through a budget. Really great idea to do that. They can go through line by line, kind of talk to them about the monthly rents, average utilities, food, parking, all of those things. And again, that's a free service. Also want to be considering the property owner, the reputation, the size, how many they have, and the property type. And then finally, looking specifically at the lease itself. What does the lease include? What type of restrictions? Those are considerations you're going to want to go through as well. Ohio State is vast. There are so many resources available to your students. Sometimes it's just a matter of connecting with them. At this point, you've got a really good start because you know about student legal services and you know about off-campus and commuter student engagement. You will get with your electronic materials, a list of important links that does include these resources. So definitely take a look at those. I would also encourage you to really take a dive around in both of our websites. We have a lot of information that's available to you. And in fact, our office has a specific page just for off-campus housing. Off-campus housing is not the only area of law that we cover in our office. And by far, it's a big part, but it's not the only one. So there's also a lot of other information that could be valuable to you and your students on our website.
Thanks, Molly. And then finally, we just wanted to show you a quick snapshot of what we do with the students during the session. We go through this factor analysis, which really lets the students think about and articulate what their priorities are in terms of off-campus housing and when they're looking for that off-campus, perfect place for them and their roommates. And so that's something that you can certainly participate in and work through with your student if you so choose, but wanted to make sure you guys knew that this was also part of the conversation with students and their discussion. Okay, so on the screen, you will see our office emails. We've included sorority and fraternity life as well, because I know some of you did have questions about your student living off campus in a second year approved housing. And so they can definitely answer questions like that. But I'm going to pause here and see if we have a few more questions we might be able to address before we wrap up today's webinar.
I would love to jump in because I saw one that jumped right out at me on the page. And we had someone who asked, said that their student took a tour and the landlord told them that don't worry about getting a lease review because their lease has already been approved by Student Legal Services, and that is not correct. So we are the attorneys for students, and so what we focus on is your students' rights and responsibilities. We do not advise landlords about their leases, and we do not approve any landlord's lease. So if that has been told to you or your student, that is false. Nor does, again, as we talked about early on, the university endorse any property owners or specific properties. So please, we want you to be able to utilize our resources and get that lease review. I also saw some other questions about lease reviews in the Q&A. One was, can a parent send a lease to SLS for a review, or does the student need to do this? Your student needs to schedule the appointment. The services are for them. That being said, when your student schedules an appointment, there is a place for them to put in whether or not they would like to have anyone else, including their roommates, or a parent or a family member or other support person, to be in on the lease review. So we would be happy to include you. It just has to be the student who initiates that appointment.
Now I'm happy to take a look here at some other questions that you all may be able to answer. There's a question about working with landlords to adjust the joint and several liability clause, and if that's an option for folks or how somebody may go about doing that.
So never say never. I always encourage students to ask the questions and their families for anything that they would like to negotiate. You're in a much better position than, say, 10 to 15 years ago when we had a different relationship between supply and demand. I will say, though, that the landlords who do have joint and several liability clauses in their leases usually have them there for a reason, and that is to protect their property and their ability to collect the rent. They are business people after all, and so they do want to ensure that they will be paid. So that is one that's a little bit more difficult to negotiate, but it's certainly worth a try.
Thank you.
Molly, there's a follow-up about that, about how you may know that a property has that in their clause or not. Maybe that's a meeting that students should schedule with you all to look at the leases.
Absolutely. So that, again, that's something that it's top priority for us when we're doing a lease review, is to determine for the student whether that is a joint and several lease or whether it is an individual lease. There is going to be language in the lease, but sometimes it's a little nuanced and it doesn't always say in bold joint and several liability. So if it's not clear from the lease, or the landlord has told you that it is an individual lease, we still recommend that you come in and have that lease review, just so we can guarantee that that's the case. And the reason why I say that is there are some leases that will say they're individual, but then they assign liability for common spaces to everyone, and that might put it in the realm of a joint and several liability lease. And so we got to be careful about some of those terms.
Probably just a general question that maybe Dilna, you can shed some light on, is folks are wondering though when most leases actually start.
Great question. So most leases that we see, and Molly certainly jump in as well, usually we see it start somewhere mid-August. So before the actual academic year starts, then it goes through the following year, that July 31st. That gives the property owners about 2 weeks or so to turn over their properties for the next tenant. So again, that's kind of where that 11.5-month lease comes into play with 12 installments. But yeah, somewhere between beginning to mid-August.
And along those lines, I did see a question about suggestions for students who want to move in over the summer. So maybe they're a second-year student and there's a little bit of a gap in between when their lease for the next year starts. Certainly that is an opportunity for you to sublease. The other thing you can do is just call the landlords and find out if they have properties that might be available. There's not a lot of short-term leasing available in the university district. That being said, they may know about some of their tenants who do want to sublease. There is a sublease search, am I correct there, Dilna, on your website, on offcampus.osu.edu, that, like the roommate search, you can post and look through different people who are either looking for subleasing or who are posting their own properties to be subleased. If you are, again, a few points for that if you're considering your students considering subleasing, or they're actually going to take a sublease, or they're going to give a sublease. Make sure your landlord allows for that, and also have an agreement in writing between the parties, the two people, both the person who's subleasing from and the subleasing to. And again, that's something that we do have a sample agreement on our website, but we would like to talk to your student about that if they're considering doing that.
There's a couple questions in here from parents asking how students can access this information. If you have upcoming sessions for students similar to this one, how their students can also get this info.
Absolutely. So students can go to a Go link that, if we could maybe get this in the chat as well, go.osu.edu/smooth-move. And this is where we actually have an upcoming date for students to attend if they would like to, and we'll have that recorded as well, so they can access that whenever they would like. And then they'll also get the packet of information with the helpful links and the worksheet, so they can have some tangible pieces to kind of work with moving forward.
Yep, and we're going to market that pretty widely to students, that webinar. And some of you parents, I recognize your names from the parent and family web groups that you know that I engage with you on occasion, and I'll throw that up in there as well.
Got a question in here for probably both of you about what may be typical for a landlord to charge: sewer, water, trash. Like, what is typically seen in a lease that someone will be responsible for?
Sure. So I think I'll jump in, and then Molly, you whatever I'm missing. So oftentimes it's also about the type of unit. So in apartments, we'll see gas, electric, and sometimes water, but usually you may see water more so in the houses. And then in terms of trash and sewer, Molly, could you address that one?
Yeah, generally water, sewer, and trash are going to be all bundled together. So I know in some municipalities and some other states, those are unbundled, but generally in Columbus, those are going to be one charge. And so your lease should identify whether or not you are paying for that, or whether or not the landlord pays for it. And if the landlord pays for it, sometimes they bill you back. So that's a really important thing. And that's something that we do include in that guide when they're reviewing the different properties. Because if you're looking at two different properties, one's, but they're both $600 a month, monthly rent. If you've got one that includes all the utilities in that $600 and the other you're paying for that, those are going to be something that you're going to want to look at when trying to make the determination about whether to rent. So you want to make sure that that is covered in the lease, so that there's no surprises that come up later.
Someone asked a question for your end, Molly. If you could just quickly review how a student actually makes an appointment with your office.
Absolutely. studentlegal.osu.edu. Very easy. Go on our webpage and there's a big red button that says make an appointment. It takes you to our appointment schedule, our online appointment scheduler. For our lease review appointments, you will read the directions there, but we ask that the student watch a 20-minute video beforehand, and that covers the really broad concepts, and it's really nice because they can go back to that when they're starting to move in and to re-review, and then they'll have that appointment with the attorney where they go through their specific lease. So again, all of that is outlined on our webpage. Our lease review appointments we are doing by phone. If it is important to you and or your student to do that by Zoom, you can just ask for that when you schedule the appointment.
And then Molly, there's a follow-up question to that, a different question, but it's more of a follow-up. But once they have that lease review, then what does that look like on your end? Is there a red line copy provided to the students? What do they get back once you have done that lease review?
That's a great question. So no, we don't give a red line copy. We do ask that they're taking notes as they go along. And we certainly will take the time with them if they have follow-up questions and those types of things. The other thing is we're open if you have, if something comes up and you have more questions, schedule another appointment. We are here for you and we want to help in whatever way we can.
Just trying to look through the questions. And I see a question here a couple times about whether, for example, if the total monthly cost is $1,000 and there are two roommates, will each be paying $500 or $1,000 each? My guess is that's something that they would need to clarify with the landlord, what exactly they're saying to them.
Absolutely. And they might be referring to the off-campus housing search on Dilna's website. Do you want to address that on that search, Dilna?
Sure. We do our best to encourage the property owners to list it as total monthly rent, right? Because you could have a 2-bedroom apartment and have one bedroom be much larger and have its own bathroom and the other one be much smaller. And that might work for you and your student because one person might have a different budget than the other. So we don't always assume that they're paying equal monthly rent. And so that's why part of the reason why we ask landlords to list it per unit full amount of rent. Now, if you go on there and it just seems too good to be true, it might be, and that might have been a miss on our part. So definitely worth clarifying with the property owner that it's the total monthly rent for all the roommates put together.
Maybe just a couple more here. We got one of how can a landlord give an actual tour of a rental property if somebody is currently living there?
That's a great question. So under Ohio law, the landlord has to give notice that they are going to come into a property, and they're supposed to provide 24-hour written notice before they come in. So that's what they do. That's what they're supposed to do anyway. So if they're going to allow prospective tenants to tour the property, they'll give the current tenants notice that they are going to tour that property. And I think that brings us up to actually another good point is when we're talking about evaluating these properties, and I'm not sure that we covered this earlier in the talk, it is, if you hear your students say this, it is actually fairly common for prospective tenants to go knock on the door of the current tenants to ask them questions about that property. It happens all the time. We do ask them to kind of go in pairs, but students expect that. This is leasing season, and everybody who's living off campus, sometimes you'll even see on the door, like, we're here from 3 to 5 if you want to come back and ask us questions. And that happens, I think, too, particularly with some of those more in-demand houses. But that is how they handle the tours. Is in general, they should be giving the current tenants notice that they'll be coming in and providing that tour.
And then maybe a question for you, Donna. One parent is asking just kind of a comparison of on-campus living versus off-campus living as it relates to cost structures, things that might be a little bit different. I mean, I know obviously meal plans and food and other things go into that as well as type of property, but just maybe what you hear in conversations with students.
Sure. So I think it's a little bit different, right? It's kind of comparing apples to oranges initially, and then you kind of have to make it a solid comparison. When you're looking at the cost on campus, right, that's going to be the cost. I believe they do it per semester. So going through and delineating what that would equate to on a monthly basis. In addition, in when you're living off campus, which we talked about, you're paying for utilities. That's typically going to be a separate cost in general. And so when you're living on campus, all of that is bundled in there together. They're getting their cable, they're getting their internet, all of those pieces. So I think really being able to compare those two, you're going to want your student to do that carefully. And again, I know Molly mentioned this earlier, but I would really plug the Student Wellness Center's Scarlet and Gray Financial Coaching. I think they can really help provide even more of that detailed information specific to your student circumstance.
And maybe we've got several other questions in here. And if you've asked a question and we have not had a chance to get to it, just make sure your email address is in there. I mean, there's probably 30 or 40 questions left in the chat, and we're not going to have time to get to all of them. So we'll make sure that we send you an email specifically to answer your question. So kind of the last question is the timeline. We have a parent who said, if leases are starting in August, are folks really looking at signing leases now for next year? I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but potentially reviewing what that timeline is for students.
Yes. The answer is yes, they are looking for next year. I want to reiterate that I, under no circumstances, want any student or parent to feel pressured into signing a lease. Please have that talk with your student that if there is any reason to feel like they're not comfortable with moving forward, whether it's because they're not really sure their roommate is who they want to live with. This is pretty early on, even having known maybe that person for a year. Some of these students, though, I think someone pointed out, it really is difficult for sophomores this year because they're still meeting people. They didn't have as much opportunity last year. So encourage them to take some time to really consider. I do think last year we saw the leasing season kind of push back just a little bit. And supply and demand, let's think about it this way. Those 2-3 bedroom places, there's more of them. There's more supply for them. Last year, when we were looking at there were some sophomores who had an exemption to live off campus, they were still finding places in June and July before the school started. So just keep that in mind, that as opposed to rushing right now and really feeling pressured, it's so important for them to be going through the process of feeling comfortable and doing the research and having those conversations with roommates and really finding out about the landlords. Things like, a landlord saying, oh, it's okay, we've already, reviewed that lease. Be careful about conversations like that. Be careful, keep your parent and family ears attuned. Some of those things that are getting your intuition up, you should trust that for sure.
Thanks, Molly. And I think Molly and I would like to thank Ryan and Terry. Thank you guys so much for joining us today, and everyone here participating. Thank you for your many great questions. I know there's a lot more that we are still going to be addressing. So again, as Ryan said, make sure that your email is included in that chat along with your questions. We will be sending this information out with other materials, and then we'll be addressing each of those questions as well. But thank you all so much. And you have our contact information up on the screen, so please do not hesitate to reach out to us at any time. And again, if you don't get anything else out of this, but one thing, it's make sure your student signs or has that lease review from Student Legal Services before they sign anything.
Thank you so much, Dilna.
Thanks.